There is a nightmare that haunts every sailor who has worked the Great Lakes. It starts with a sound, not the roar of wind or the crash of waves, but something worse, a metallic groan that rises from deep within the ship itself. Steel screaming, rivets popping like gunfire, and then, if you're unlucky enough to be awake for it, you feel the deck beneath your feet begin to bend. This is the moment when physics becomes horror, when a 600-foot steel freighter, built to carry thousands of tons across open water, becomes weightless. The bow lifts, the stern lifts, and the middle of the ship, with nothing beneath it but air and the trough of a wave, begins to sag under its own impossible weight. The hull flexes, the metal screams louder, and then it snaps. This isn't theoretical. This isn't a what-if scenario from an engineering textbook. This has happened again and again on one body of water more than any other. Lake Erie, the smallest of the Great Lakes, the shallowest, the warmest, and by a terrifying margin, the deadliest. Over 2,000 ships rest on the bottom of Lake Erie. That's more wrecks per square mile than any other body of fresh water on Earth. More than Lake Superior, which is 4 times larger. More than Lake Michigan, which is 3 times deeper. Lake Erie is a graveyard, and the question that has haunted sailors, engineers, and investigators for over a century is simple. Why? What is it about this lake that turns steel into splinters? What creates waves so violent that experienced captains would rather face the open Atlantic than cross Erie in a storm? And why do ships not just sink here but vanish, leaving behind no wreckage, no bodies, no trace at all? The answer lies in physics that most people never learn. It lies in a geometric trap built into the lake's very shape. And it lies in a warning that indigenous people carved into the name of the lake itself, thousands of years before the first European ever saw these waters. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how a ship made of steel, longer than 2 football fields, can be lifted into the air and snapped in half like a dry twig. You will hear the story of the SS Daniel J. Morell, whose crew felt their ship break beneath them on a November night in 1966. And you will meet the one man who survived 38 hours in freezing water, watching his friends die one by one in the darkness. You will learn about Black Friday, November 1916, when Lake Erie killed 4 ships in a single afternoon and left one captain clinging to wreckage for 30 hours, the only survivor of 28 men, asking himself why he lived when everyone else died. And you will hear about ships that didn't just sink, but disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found. Not wreckage, not bodies, not even debris. Just empty water where a 400-foot steel vessel used to be. But first, we need to go to the people who lived here before there were ships made of steel. Because they knew. They saw what this lake could do. And they tried to warn us. The legend of the panther. Long before Europeans arrived in North America, long before there were steel ships or cargo freighters or steam engines, the indigenous people who lived along the shores of Lake Erie had a name for the lake. They called it Ariel Honan. The name comes from the Erie and Iroquois peoples. It translates roughly to long tail or cat tail. But the meaning is deeper than that. The lake, they said, held the spirit of a giant panther. The panther was not always hostile. Most of the time it lay still and calm, stretched out in the sun, purring. The water would be flat, the sky would be clear, and people could cross the lake in safety. But the panther had a temper. Without warning, it could twitch its tail, and when it did, the lake would erupt. Waves would rise, winds would howl, and anyone on the water would be swallowed. The Iroquois warned travelers. They said you could never trust the lake. Even on a calm day, the panther could wake. And once it woke, there was no escape. They said the panther didn't give warnings. It didn't growl or pace. It just waited. And when you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, it struck. Fast, sudden, lethal. For centuries, European settlers dismissed this as folklore, just a story, a myth to explain something people didn't understand, superstition from people who didn't have science or instruments or weather forecasts. But here's the thing. The myth and the physics describe the exact same phenomenon. Because what the Iroquois called the panther's tail, modern engineers call something else. They call it a square wave. The physics of vertical death. Let's start with something most people believe about waves. If you've spent any time near the ocean, you know what waves feel like. They roll, they swell, they lift you up and set you down. There's a rhythm to them, a predictability. Even in a storm, ocean waves follow a pattern. They build, they crest, they break, and then there's a pause before the next one arrives. Ships are designed around this rhythm. Hulls are shaped to ride up one side of a wave and down the other. It's not comfortable, but it's survivable. Now forget all of that. Lake Erie doesn't have rolling waves. Lake Erie has spikes. Stand on the shore during a storm and you'll see it. The water doesn't swell in smooth hills. It jumps. Waves don't build gradually. They erupt straight up like walls. 20-foot waves that are nearly vertical. Waves that don't roll toward you but punch upward, as if the lake itself is trying to climb out of its own basin. Sailors have a term for this. They call them square waves. And if you've ever seen footage of square waves, you know they look wrong. They look like a glitch in reality, like two separate bodies of water colliding at right angles, creating a checkerboard pattern of peaks and troughs that shouldn't be possible. But on Lake Erie, this isn't a rare phenomenon. It's the default. And this is what the Iroquois saw. They didn't have the language of fluid dynamics or meteorology. They didn't have instruments to measure wave height or frequency. But they had eyes, and they watched the lake for generations. And what they saw was water that didn't behave like other water. Water that could lie flat and then suddenly spike upward in sharp, jagged lines. Water that looked like it was being whipped. Like something underneath was thrashing. Like a tail, so they called it the panther's tail. And they told their children, when you see the tail twitch, get off the water. Because the panther is awake, and when the panther wakes, it kills. Modern engineers call this phenomenon cross seas, or square wave interference. They talk about wave periods in fetch distance and resonance frequency. But the Iroquois and the engineers are describing the same thing. The panther and the physics. They both kill the same way. Let me show you how. Why shallow means deadly wave behavior is determined by depth. When you're in deep water, a wave is just energy moving through the medium. The water itself doesn't travel far. It's the energy that moves, and the wave stays relatively smooth because there's room beneath it. The energy can dissipate downward. It has space. Lake Erie has no space. The average depth of Lake Erie is 62 feet. That's shallow. Absurdly shallow for a lake of its size. To put that in perspective, Lake Superior averages over 480 feet deep. Lake Michigan is 279 feet. Even Lake Ontario, the smallest by surface area, is 283 feet deep. Erie is a puddle by comparison. And when a wave tries to move through a puddle, it has nowhere to go but up. Think of it this way. Imagine you're pushing water in a bathtub. If the tub is deep, the water can circulate down and around. But if the tub is shallow, the water has to pile up. It has to climb. The energy can't dissipate downward because there's no downward to dissipate into. So it goes vertical. Now scale that up to a lake that is 241 miles long and 57 miles wide, and imagine a 60-mile-per-hour wind pushing across it. The wind is transferring energy into the water, and that energy has to go somewhere. In a deep lake, it spreads out. In Lake Erie, it spikes, but it gets worse. 'Cause Erie isn't just shallow, it's also shaped like a funnel. The western basin, near Toledo, is only about 25 to 30 feet deep. The central basin averages around 60 feet. and the eastern basin near Buffalo drops to about 80 feet. That means waves are constantly moving from shallow to less shallow to slightly deeper water, and every time the depth changes, the wave changes shape. Waves compress, they steepen, they become shorter and more frequent. Which brings us to the second killer, wave period. The 4-second trap. In the open ocean, waves are typically spaced 10 to 15 seconds apart. That might not sound like much, but it's everything. When a ship is climbing a wave, the hull is under stress. The bow is being lifted, the stern might still be in the trough, and the entire structure is flexing. But then the ship crests the wave, and for a few seconds, the stress releases. The hull settles. The crew catches their breath. And then the next wave arrives, 10 to 15 seconds. That's enough time for the ship to recover, enough time for the structure to reset, enough time for the captain to adjust course, for the crew to brace, for the pumps to catch up if water is coming over the deck. On Lake Erie, waves arrive every 4 seconds. 4 seconds. You don't recover from one wave before the next one hits. You don't reset. You don't adjust. You just get hammered. Again and again and again, with no pause, no rhythm, no mercy. This is what sailors call the 4-second trap, and it is one of the primary reasons Lake Erie is so deadly. Imagine you're on a ship in an Erie storm. A 20-foot wave hits the bow. The ship lurches, the hull flexes, water crashes over the deck, the crew is thrown against the walls, and before anyone can even stand up, the next wave hits. And then the next, and then the next. 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. The hull never stops flexing. The stress never releases. And every wave adds a little more damage. A rivet loosens. A weld cracks. A seam starts to weep. And the ship, which was built to handle stress in intervals, is now under continuous, unrelenting stress. It's not a single catastrophic blow that sinks most ships on Lake Erie. It's 1,000 smaller blows, delivered faster than the ship can absorb them. And this is the panther's method. It doesn't kill with one strike. It kills with repetition. It claws. It bites. It doesn't let go. It doesn't pause. It just keeps hitting until you break. The Iroquois saw this pattern. They saw how the lake could batter a canoe until the wood split. They saw how it could exhaust even the strongest paddler. They didn't know about wave frequency or structural fatigue, but they knew the result. The lake doesn't stop, and if you can't outlast it, it kills you. But even this isn't the worst part, because Lake Erie doesn't just hit you from one direction. The square wave phenomenon. The panther's tail. Here's where it gets truly strange. In most bodies of water, waves move in one direction. The wind blows, the waves build, and they travel in the direction the wind is pushing them. Simple. But Lake Erie is oriented southwest to northeast. It's long and narrow, and when the wind blows down the length of the lake, it creates waves moving northeast. But Erie is also shallow enough that the wind can create secondary waves moving in other directions, especially if the wind shifts or if there are pressure changes from a storm system. What happens when two wave systems meet? They don't merge, they intersect. And when they intersect, they create something called a cross sea, or a square wave pattern. From above, it looks like a grid. Waves moving in one direction, waves moving in another. And where they meet, the water doesn't know what to do. So it does both. It rises in sharp pyramidal peaks. It creates troughs that drop deeper than either wave system alone would create. And it produces chaotic, unpredictable water that moves in ways that seem to defy physics. This is the panther's tail. When the Iroquois said the panther could twitch its tail and the lake would erupt, this is what they meant. Because square waves don't announce themselves. They don't build gradually. One moment the water is rough but manageable, and the next moment you're in a cross sea, getting hit from two directions at once, and your boat is being twisted in ways it was never designed to handle. For a ship, this is a nightmare, because a hull is designed to move through waves in a line, bow to stern. The ship is built to flex along its length, to ride up and over. But when waves are hitting from two directions at once, the ship isn't flexing in one axis. It's twisting, it's torquing, and steel, for all its strength, does not like to twist. This is when you start to hear the rivets pop. This is when the deck starts to buckle. This is when captains realize they're not in a storm. They're in a trap. And the trap was set by the shape of the lake itself. Because Erie's shallow depth and narrow orientation create the perfect conditions for cross seas. The lake is too shallow for waves to dissipate downward, and too narrow for waves to spread out sideways. So they collide. They interfere. They create standing wave patterns that can last for hours. And if you're in a ship when that happens, you're not fighting the weather. You're fighting geometry. The Iroquois didn't have the math to explain it. But they saw the pattern. They saw how the lake could attack from multiple directions, how it could twist and flip canoes, how it didn't behave like rivers or other lakes. So they gave it a name that fit. The panther, the ambush predator, the animal that doesn't charge straight at you but circles, strikes from the side, from behind, from angles you don't expect. Lake Erie is an ambush predator, and the square wave is its killing stroke. Hogging and sagging. Now we get to the part that breaks ships in half. There are two forces that act on a ship's hull when it's in rough water. They have technical names, but sailors use simpler terms. Hogging and sagging. Hogging is what happens when the bow and stern of a ship are supported by the crests of two waves, but the middle of the ship is hanging in the trough between them. The ship's weight is pulling the middle downward, but the ends are being held up. The hull bends into an upward arch, like a suspension bridge. This is called hogging, because the shape resembles the arched back of a hog. Sagging is the opposite. The middle of the ship is on the crest of a wave, but the bow and stern are hanging unsupported in troughs on either side. Now the weight of the ends is pulling down, and the middle is being pushed up. The hull bends into a downward curve, sagging in the center. Both of these forces are normal. Every ship experiences them. Naval architects account for this. Hulls are designed to flex. Steel is strong. Modern ships have reinforced keels, internal bracing, and structural supports specifically designed to handle hogging and sagging. But there's a limit. And on Lake Erie, that limit gets tested in ways it never does anywhere else. Remember the 4-second wave interval. Now add hogging and sagging into that equation. The ship crests a wave. It hogs. 4 seconds later, it's in a trough. It sags. 4 seconds later, it hogs again. 4 seconds sag. 4 seconds hog. The hull is flexing back and forth, over and over, with no time to rest. And every time it flexes, the stress concentrates in the same place, the midpoint of the ship. Think of bending a paper clip. The first time you bend it, nothing happens. The second time, it's fine. But keep bending it back and forth. And eventually the metal fatigues. It gets weaker, and then suddenly it snaps. Ships are made of steel, not paper clips. But the principle is the same. And on Lake Erie, in the middle of a storm, a ship might hog and sag 900 times in an hour. 900 cycles of stress. 900 moments where the hull is being pulled in opposite directions. 900 chances for a weld to crack, for a rivet to shear, for a structural plate to buckle. And then, on the 901st wave, the ship doesn't flex anymore. It breaks. This is how the panther kills the big prey. Not with a single bite, but with exhaustion. The panther clamps down and holds. The prey struggles. The panther holds. The prey weakens. The panther holds. And when the prey finally can't struggle anymore, the panther finishes it. Lake Erie does the same thing to ships. It clamps down with waves every 4 seconds. The ship flexes. The lake holds. The ship flexes. The lake holds. And when the ship finally can't flex anymore, when the metal has been bent back and forth so many times that the molecular structure starts to fail, the lake finishes it. The hull snaps. The ship breaks in half. And the crew has seconds, maybe minutes, before they're in the water. Let me show you exactly what that looks like, how a ship snaps in half. Let's be very specific about what happens in the seconds before a ship breaks apart. You're standing on the deck of a freighter. Let's say it's 600 feet long, built in the 1950s, steel-riveted construction. You're carrying a full load of iron ore or coal, maybe 14,000 tons of cargo in the hold. The ship weighs, all told, around 20,000 tons when fully loaded. The storm has been building for hours. Waves are 20, maybe 25 feet. They're coming every 4 seconds. The ship is pitching hard. You've been hogging and sagging for the last 2 hours. You feel the bow rise. The whole front of the ship lifts as it climbs a wave. At the same time, the stern is still down in a trough. The middle of the ship is suspended. You are standing in the center of the deck, and beneath you, there is nothing. No water, just air. The ship is now a bridge, a 600-foot steel bridge holding up its own weight, and 14,000 tons of cargo with no support in the middle. The weight pulls down. The hull begins to bend. You don't see this, but you feel it. The deck beneath your feet is no longer flat. It's curving, and you hear the sound. It starts as a low groan, metal under stress. The rivets holding the hull plates together are stretching. Some of them are starting to shear. You hear them pop. 1, then 2, then a dozen, like firecrackers going off inside the walls. The ship crests the wave. For a moment, the stress releases. The hull tries to straighten, and then the next wave hits. Now the middle of the ship is on a crest. The bow and stern drop into troughs. The ship sags. The weight of the bow pulls forward. The weight of the stern pulls backward. And the hull, which just bent upward 2 seconds ago, now bends downward. This is the moment when metal fatigue becomes catastrophic failure, because the hull has been flexing for hours. The rivets have been loosening. The welds have been cracking. And now, in this single moment of maximum stress, something gives. Maybe it's a seam along the deck. Maybe it's a support beam inside the cargo hold. Maybe it's a fracture that's been growing for miles, invisible, deep in the hull plating. But once it starts, it happens fast. The crack spreads. Steel tears. The hull separates. And the two halves of the ship, no longer held together, begin to move independently. The bow section, now free, rises on the next wave. The stern section, still being pushed by its own momentum, continues forward. For a few seconds, they're still close together, close enough that someone on the stern could see the jagged edge of the bow section pulling away. And then the lake pours in. Both halves flood. The bow usually goes first, nose down, pulled under by the weight of the cargo. The stern can sometimes stay afloat a little longer, especially if the engine room stays sealed. There are cases where the stern section has stayed on the surface for minutes, propeller still turning, engine still running, before it finally slips beneath the waves. For the crew, there's almost no time. If you're in the section that breaks off first, you're underwater in seconds. If you're in the section that stays afloat, you have minutes at most. The water is cold. In November, Lake Erie's surface temperature is around 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, you lose consciousness in 15 to 30 minutes. You die within an hour. There are no lifeboats. There's no time to launch them. You're in the water, in the dark, in a storm, and you have maybe half an hour before hypothermia takes you. This is not theoretical. This is what happened to the crew of the SS Daniel J. Morell. But before we get to the Morell, we need to talk about the day Lake Erie killed 4 ships at once. Because if you want to understand what it looks like when the Panther truly wakes, you need to hear about Black Friday. Black Friday, November 9th, 1916. November 9th, 1916 started as an ordinary late-season shipping day on Lake Erie. The weather was cold, but not extreme. Winds were moderate. The forecast called for increasing clouds and possible rain, but nothing that would stop commercial traffic. Captains checked their barometers, looked at the sky, and made the decision that thousands of captains had made before them. They left port. By mid-morning, there were dozens of ships on Lake Erie, freighters carrying coal, iron ore, and grain, passenger steamers, fishing boats, all of them making routine crossings, all of them assuming they had time to reach the other side before the weather turned. They were wrong. By noon, the wind had shifted. The barometric pressure dropped. And within 2 hours, Lake Erie went from calm to catastrophic. Winds hit 60 miles per hour. Waves built to 25 feet. The temperature dropped. Snow began to fall, thick and blinding. Visibility went to 0. And the ships, scattered across the lake, suddenly realized they were in trouble. This wasn't a normal storm. This was what meteorologists now call a bomb cyclone, a rapid intensification event where atmospheric pressure drops so fast that winds and waves build in minutes, not hours. The Iroquois would have called it something else. They would have said the Panther woke up angry. By mid-afternoon, 4 ships were fighting for their lives. The first was the Merida, a 445-foot steel freighter carrying iron ore. She was caught in the central basin directly in the path of the storm. Waves were hitting her broadside. The ship was rolling so hard that cargo shifted in the hold. Water poured over the deck. The crew sent out a distress signal, but there was no one close enough to help. At 3 p.m., the Merida capsized. She rolled onto her side, hung there for a moment, and then slipped beneath the waves. 23 men went down with her. No survivors. The second ship was the James B. Colgate, a 471-foot freighter loaded with coal. She was further east, near Long Point, trying to make a run for the Canadian shore. The captain, Walter Grashaw, knew the ship was in trouble. The waves were too steep. The interval was too short. The hull was flexing with every impact. And then, just after 4 p.m., the crew heard the sound. Rivets popping, steel groaning, the same sound that would haunt Dennis Hale 50 years later on the Morell. Captain Grashaw ordered the crew to the lifeboats, but there was no time. The Colgate's hull split amidships. The bow section went down immediately. The stern stayed afloat for several minutes, long enough for a few men to jump into the water. 25 men died, 3 survived. One of them was Captain Grashaw. He clung to a piece of wreckage for 30 hours. The water temperature was 39 degrees. The air temperature was below freezing. Snow and sleet battered him through the night. He watched the other 2 survivors die. One slipped off the wreckage in the darkness. The other just stopped moving, froze to death while still holding on. Grashaw was found the next morning by a Canadian fishing boat. He was unconscious, covered in ice, hypothermic. He survived, but he never captained a ship again. In interviews later, he said the same thing Dennis Hale would say 50 years later. The sound stayed with him. The sound of the ship breaking, the sound of the rivets popping, the way the deck split open beneath his feet. He said he didn't know why he survived. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't luckier. He just didn't die. And he spent the rest of his life asking himself why. The third ship was the Marshall F. Butters, a 420-foot freighter carrying grain. She went down near Pelee Island. No distress signal. No survivors. The wreck wasn't found for 3 years. The fourth ship was the D.L. Filer, a wooden schooner. She broke apart in the western basin. Wreckage washed ashore near Toledo. No survivors. By the time the storm cleared on the morning of November 10th, 4 ships were gone. 76 men were dead. And the lake, once again, was calm, flat, quiet, glassy, as if nothing had happened. This is what terrified people about Black Friday. Not just the violence of the storm, but the speed. The lake had been calm in the morning. By noon, it was killing ships. By evening, it was over. The Panther had struck, fast, sudden, lethal. And then it went back to sleep. Sailors who had been on the lake that day said the same thing. They said the storm didn't feel like weather. It felt intentional, like something had decided to kill and then stopped when it was satisfied. The Iroquois would have understood. They would have said, "You woke the Panther," and the Panther was hungry. Black Friday became a legend among Great Lakes sailors. It was studied by meteorologists, investigated by marine boards, analyzed by engineers. But no amount of study could change the fundamental truth. Lake Erie had gone from calm to deadly in under 2 hours. And it could do it again, anytime, without warning. The panther was always there, always watching, always waiting. And sometimes it woke up. The SS Daniel J. Morell, November 29, 1966. 50 years after Black Friday, the lake proved it hadn't changed. The Morell was a bulk freighter, 603 feet long, built in 1906. She was old, but she was solid. Steel hull, riveted construction, powered by a coal-fired steam engine. She'd been working the Great Lakes for 60 years, carrying iron ore and coal between ports on Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Erie. On November 28, 1966, the Morell left Buffalo, New York, heading northwest across Lake Erie toward Detroit. She was carrying a load of iron ore. The crew numbered 29 men. The forecast called for rough weather, but nothing unusual for late November. Captain Arthur Crawley, an experienced lakes captain, decided to proceed. By the evening of November 29th, the weather had worsened. Winds were gusting to 65 miles per hour. Waves were building to 25 feet. The Morell was taking heavy seas over the bow. The ship was pitching hard, hogging and sagging with every wave. Around 2 a.m. on November 29th, the crew began to hear the sound. Dennis Hale, a 26-year-old watchman, was in the aft cabin when he heard it. He described it later as a screeching sound like metal tearing. Other crew members reported hearing rivets popping. The ship was groaning under the stress. Hale said it sounded like the ship was alive, like it was screaming. At 2 a.m., the Morell broke in half. The fracture occurred amidships, almost exactly in the center of the vessel. The bow section separated cleanly from the stern. The bow rose on a wave, and then it was gone, pulled under by the weight of the cargo in the forward holds. It sank in seconds. 16 men were in the bow section. None of them had time to react. They were just gone. The stern section stayed afloat. Dennis Hale, along with 3 other crew members, managed to scramble onto a life raft that had broken free from the deck. The raft was open, no cover, just a flat platform with rope handles. The men clung to it as the stern section of the Morell drifted nearby. Engines still running, propellers spinning in the air every time the stern rose on a wave. For several minutes, the stern floated. Some of the crew were still aboard, trapped in the aft compartments. They could be heard shouting, but there was no way to reach them. And then the stern began to settle. Water poured into the engine room. The stern tilted, nose up, propeller rising higher, and then it slid backward into the lake and disappeared. Dennis Hale and the 3 men with him were now alone on the raft in the middle of Lake Erie in a November storm. The air temperature was 35 degrees. The water temperature was 38 degrees. Waves were still 20 feet high. The raft had no shelter, no supplies, no radio. The men were soaked. They were wearing work clothes, not survival suits. Hypothermia set in within minutes. One by one, the other men lost consciousness. Hale tried to keep them awake, but there was nothing he could do. By dawn, 2 of the men were dead. By mid-morning, the 3rd man died. Dennis Hale was alone. He stayed on that raft for 38 hours. He later said he didn't know why he survived. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't more prepared. He just didn't die. He said the cold wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. After the 3rd man died, there was no sound, just the wind and the waves, and Hale lying on the raft, surrounded by the bodies of his friends, waiting to die. He said he talked to them. He talked to the dead men. He apologized for being alive. He asked them why they died, and he didn't. He said he prayed, not for rescue, just for it to be over. But it wasn't over. On the afternoon of November 30th, a Coast Guard helicopter spotted the raft. Hale was unconscious, curled into a fetal position covered in ice. His core body temperature was 94 degrees. He had severe frostbite on his hands and feet. The doctors didn't think he would make it, but he did. Dennis Hale was the only survivor of the USS Daniel J. Morell. 28 men died. The bow section of the ship was found later, resting on the bottom of Lake Erie in 220 feet of water. The stern section was found nearby. Both halves showed the same thing, a clean break, right down the center, caused by structural failure during hogging and sagging. Hale spent the rest of his life telling the story. He gave interviews. He spoke at maritime museums. He wrote about what it felt like to be the only survivor. He said the hardest part wasn't the cold. It wasn't the fear. It was the sound of the ship breaking, the screeching metal, the way the rivets popped like gunfire, the way the deck split open beneath his feet. He said that sound stayed with him. He heard it in his sleep. He heard it when he was awake. He heard it every time he looked at a body of water. He said he never went back on a ship, not once, not even a ferry. He couldn't, because he knew what the lake could do. He knew how fast it happened, how little time there was, how the ship just broke, and then it was over, and there was nothing anyone could do. He knew that the lake didn't care how big your ship was. It didn't care how experienced you were. It didn't care if you'd been sailing for 60 years or 60 days. If the lake wanted you, it took you. And sometimes it didn't even leave a body behind. Dennis Hale lived until 2015. He was 75 years old. And in every interview, in every speech, he said the same thing. Lake Erie is not like other water. Lake Erie is alive, and it remembers. The graveyard of the Great Lakes. The Morell is one of the most famous wrecks on Lake Erie, but it is far from the only one. Lake Erie is called the shipwreck capital of the world, and the numbers back it up. There are over 2,000 documented shipwrecks on the bottom of Lake Erie. That's more wrecks per square mile than any other body of fresh water on the planet. More than the Bermuda Triangle. More than the North Atlantic. More than any other Great Lake. To put that in perspective, Lake Superior, which is the largest and deepest of the Great Lakes, has around 350 known wrecks. Lake Michigan has around 1,500. Lake Erie, which is smaller than both, has 2,000. Why? We've already covered the physics, the shallow depth, the square waves, the 4-second intervals, the hogging and sagging. But there's more to it than just rough water. Lake Erie sits at the center of the Great Lakes shipping network. It's the link between the upper lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, and the lower lake, Ontario, which connects to the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence Seaway. Every ship moving iron ore from Minnesota to Pennsylvania has to cross Lake Erie. Every coal shipment from Ohio to Canada crosses Erie. Every grain shipment, every cargo load, every bulk freighter, they all go through Erie. More traffic means more exposure. More exposure means more wrecks. But there's another factor. Lake Erie freezes, not completely, but enough. In a typical winter, 80 to 90% of Lake Erie's surface will freeze over. Ice forms along the shorelines first, then spreads toward the center. By mid-January, there are years when the entire lake is covered in ice. And when the ice breaks up in the spring, it doesn't just melt, it moves. Huge sheets of ice, some of them several feet thick, drift with the currents and the wind. These ice flows can crush a wooden ship. They can punch holes in steel hulls. They can trap a vessel in place miles from shore until the ice either breaks apart or the ship does. There are wrecks on the bottom of Lake Erie that were never sunk by storms. They were crushed by ice. The iron ore freighter, Conemaugh, was caught in an ice field in February 1897. The ice closed around her hull like a vice. The crew heard the wood cracking. They abandoned ship and walked across the ice to shore. Hours later, the ship collapsed inward and sank. The wooden steamer City of Erie was caught in ice near Long Point in 1893. The crew tried to cut their way out using saws and axes. The ice was too thick. The ship was slowly crushed over the course of 3 days. The crew survived, but the ship was a total loss. Ice doesn't sink ships the way storms do. Ice is patient. Ice surrounds you. Ice squeezes. And when the hull finally gives, it's not an explosion. It's a slow, groaning collapse. The lake kills in winter too, just differently. Then there's the fog. Lake Erie is warmer than the other Great Lakes. That means more evaporation. More evaporation means more fog. In the spring and fall, Erie can be socked in for days at a time. Visibility drops to zero. Ships navigate by compass and by feel, and sometimes they don't see the other ship until it's too late. Collisions are common in the fog. Ships have rammed each other, cut each other in half, and sunk within sight of land, all because they couldn't see. The passenger steamer Marquette collided with the freighter W.C. Moreland in dense fog near Cleveland in 1903. The Moreland's bow punched a hole in the Marquette's side. The Marquette sank in 20 minutes. 7 people died. The steel freighter William B. Davock collided with the sandsucker Sachem in fog near Pelee Island in 1906. Both ships sank. 18 men died. Fog doesn't give warnings. You're navigating by sound, by instinct, and then suddenly there's a shadow in front of you, and it's too late to turn. And then there are the storms. Erie storms are fast, faster than any other Great Lake. A storm can go from nothing to deadly in under 3 hours. Captains have left port in calm water and been fighting for their lives before they've traveled 10 miles. The lake's orientation makes it worse. Erie runs southwest to northeast, and the prevailing winds blow from the southwest. That means wind blows down the entire length of the lake, building waves for 200 miles before they hit the eastern shore. By the time a wave reaches Buffalo, it's had 200 miles to grow. And because Erie is shallow, those waves don't roll, they spike. All of this adds up to a single, unavoidable truth. Lake Erie is a trap. It looks safe. It looks small, it looks manageable, and then it kills you. The lake is littered with the evidence. Wooden schooners from the 1800s, broken and scattered across the lake bed. Steel freighters from the 1900s, snapped in half and lying in pieces. Steamers, tugs, fishing boats, passenger ships. All of them thought they could cross. All of them were wrong, and some of them disappeared so completely that nothing was ever found. The Lake Erie Triangle. But here's where it gets strange, because some of the ships that have disappeared on Lake Erie didn't just sink, they vanished. There's an area on the lake that sailors have started calling the Lake Erie Triangle. It's not an official term. You won't find it on any map. But if you talk to people who work the lakes, they know what you mean. The triangle runs roughly from Presque Isle, near Erie, Pennsylvania, to Pelee Island in Canadian waters, to Long Point on the northern shore. It's a zone where the lake is deepest, where the currents are strange, and where ships and planes have disappeared without leaving any wreckage behind. Not pieces of debris, not oil slicks, not bodies, nothing. Take the case of the SS Marquette and Bessemer No. 2. On December 7th, 1909, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2. Two left Port Stanley, Ontario, heading for Conneaut, Ohio. It was a railroad car ferry, designed to carry entire train cars across the lake. It was loaded with 30 rail cars. The crew numbered 36 men. The weather was rough, but not extreme. Winds were high, but the ship was rated for worse. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was seen leaving port. It was never seen again. No wreckage was found, no bodies, no debris, no oil slick, no distress signal. The ship simply disappeared. For years, it was assumed the ship had sunk somewhere in the middle of the lake, but no one could find it. Search teams dragged the lake bed. Divers searched the known shipping lanes. Nothing. It wasn't until 2001 that a side-scan sonar team finally found the wreck, sitting in 50 feet of water, miles from where anyone expected it to be. The ship was upside down, hull intact, no obvious signs of catastrophic damage. To this day, no one knows what happened. The ship didn't break apart. It didn't explode. It just went down, fast, and took everyone with it. The theories range from cargo shift to a rogue wave to a sudden loss of stability. But none of them explain why there was no debris, why no one got off. why the ship ended up so far from its expected route. This is not an isolated case. In 1950, a commercial airliner, a DC-4, disappeared over Lake Erie. It was flying from New York to Cleveland. The plane was in contact with air traffic control. The weather was clear. And then mid-flight, the radio went silent. The plane was never found. No wreckage, no bodies, no debris. The search covered over 100 square miles. Divers went down. Sonar sweeps were conducted. Nothing. In 1975, a fishing boat with 4 men aboard left Erie, Pennsylvania, heading out to check nets. The weather was calm. The boat never returned. A search was launched. Nothing was found. In 1990, a small plane disappeared over the lake. Clear skies, calm water. The pilot was experienced. The plane vanished. No wreckage was ever recovered. These aren't mysteries in the sense that we don't know they're gone. We know they're gone. The mystery is how. Because in every other maritime disaster, there's evidence, there's wreckage, there's debris, there's something. But in the Lake Erie Triangle, sometimes there's nothing. And that's worse. Because when you find wreckage, you have answers. You know the ship hit a reef, or capsized in a storm, or broke apart in the waves. But when there's no wreckage, the mind fills in the gaps. And the gaps are always darker than the truth. Some people blame underwater currents. Erie has strong, unpredictable currents that can move wreckage miles from where a ship went down. Maybe the debris sank too fast. Maybe it drifted into Canadian waters. Maybe it's buried under silt on the lake bed. But maybe isn't an answer. Maybe is just another question. And on Lake Erie, there are a lot of questions. Others point to the depth changes. The lake bed in the triangle area is uneven. There are underwater ridges, drop-offs, trenches. A ship could sink in 80 feet of water and slide into a trench that's 200 feet deep. It could be covered by silt within days, but that doesn't explain the planes. Planes float, at least for a while. Wreckage should have been spotted, and it doesn't explain the complete lack of debris in some cases. No life jackets, no cargo crates, no fuel slicks, nothing. It's as if the lake opened up, swallowed them, and closed again. The Iroquois would have understood. They would have said, the panther was hungry. And when the panther is hungry, it doesn't leave scraps. There is no official explanation for the Lake Erie Triangle. No scientific consensus, no government report. Just a pattern. A zone where things disappear, where the lake takes what it wants and gives nothing back. And sailors know. They know that some parts of the lake feel different. They know that the area between Pelee Island and Long Point is quieter than it should be. They know that the water there looks darker even on a sunny day. They don't talk about it much, because talking about it sounds crazy. But they know. The panther is always there, always watching, and in some places it watches more closely than others. The lake remembers. There's a phrase you hear among Great Lakes sailors, especially the old ones, the ones who've worked the lakes for 30, 40, 50 years. They say, the lake remembers. What does that mean? It means that Lake Erie has a pattern. It means that certain ships seem cursed, certain routes are unlucky, certain days feel wrong. It means that if a ship sinks in a particular spot, other ships will avoid that spot. Not because there's a reef or a hazard, just because. It means that sailors will look at a forecast, see moderate winds and manageable waves, and still refuse to leave port, because something feels off, and they're usually right. There are captains who will tell you they've felt it, a pressure in the air, a stillness in the water, a sense that the lake is watching. They'll tell you about times they changed course for no reason, took a longer route, delayed departure, and then heard later that a storm hit exactly where they would have been. They'll tell you about ships that had mechanical failures for no reason, engines that quit in the middle of the lake, then started again once they drifted to shallower water, pumps that failed, then worked fine when inspected in port. They'll tell you about radios that go silent, compasses that spin, navigation equipment that gives impossible readings. And they'll tell you that Lake Erie has moods. Some days, it's calm. You can cross without incident. The water is flat. The sky is clear. The ship runs smooth. Other days, even when the weather is fine, the lake feels hostile. The waves are choppier than they should be. The wind shifts unpredictably. The ship handles wrong. And on those days, experienced captains turn around. They go back to port. They don't care what the forecast says. They don't care what the schedule is, because they know the panther is awake. This isn't superstition, or maybe it is, but it's superstition built on experience, built on centuries of observation, built on the knowledge that Lake Erie has killed more ships than any other Great Lake, and it's still killing them. The Iroquois saw it first. They gave it a name. They built their culture around respecting it, fearing it, learning its rhythms. And then European settlers arrived, looked at the lake, and thought, we can conquer this. They built bigger ships, stronger hulls, more powerful engines, and the lake broke them anyway. Because you can't conquer Lake Erie. You can only survive it, and sometimes you don't even do that. Why Erie is different. Let's pull all of this together. Lake Erie is not the biggest of the Great Lakes. It's not the deepest. It's not the coldest. But it is the deadliest, and now you know why. It's shallow, which means waves spike instead of roll. It's oriented southwest to northeast, which means storms blow down the entire length of the lake and build energy for 200 miles. It's warm, which means more evaporation, more fog, more unpredictable weather. It freezes, which means ice flows that crush and trap. And it has traffic, constant, heavy traffic, which means more ships in harm's way. The wave interval is 4 seconds, which doesn't give ships time to recover. The square wave phenomenon creates chaotic, multi-directional wave patterns that twist and torque hulls in ways they weren't designed to handle. And the hogging and sagging cycles create structural fatigue that can snap a 600-foot steel ship in half. Add to that the speed of Erie's storms, how they appear in hours, not days, and you have a body of water that is uniquely, horrifyingly efficient at killing ships. And sometimes it kills them so completely that nothing is left behind. No wreckage, no debris, no trace, just a name on a list of missing vessels, and a mystery that will never be solved. The indigenous people saw this. They didn't have the science, but they had the wisdom. They knew the lake was dangerous in a way that other lakes were not. So they warned people. They told them the lake had a spirit, a panther, a predator. And they were right, because Lake Erie is not just water. It's a trap, a geometric, meteorological, hydrodynamic trap that has been claiming lives for thousands of years. The shallow depth creates the spike waves. The narrow orientation creates the fetch distance. The orientation to prevailing winds creates the rapid storm intensification. The temperature creates the fog. The freezing creates the ice. Every piece of Erie's geography, every aspect of its shape and depth and position combines to create the perfect killing conditions. It's not luck. It's not coincidence. It's physics. But physics doesn't explain everything. Physics doesn't explain why some ships vanish without trace, why some wrecks are found miles from where they should be, why sailors feel watched, why the lake seems to have moods. Physics doesn't explain the pattern, but the panther does. Because if you think of Lake Erie as a predator, everything makes sense. Predators are patient. Predators wait. Predators strike when you're vulnerable. Predators don't announce themselves. Predators remember. And Lake Erie does all of that. It waits for you to get comfortable. It waits for you to think you're safe. And then it strikes. Fast, sudden, lethal. And then it goes back to sleep. Flat, calm, glassy. As if nothing happened. The Iroquois saw this pattern thousands of years ago. They watched the lake kill. They watched it rest. They watched it kill again. and they tried to warn us. They said, "The lake is alive. The lake is a panther. The lake will kill you if you don't respect it." But we didn't listen. We built steel ships and thought we were safe. We built radar and sonar and thought we were prepared. We built weather models and forecasting systems and thought we could predict it. And the lake kept killing. 'Cause you can't predict a predator. You can only avoid it. And on Lake Erie, there's no avoiding it. Because if you want to move cargo across the Great Lakes, you have to cross Erie. There's no other route, no way around. You have to cross the panther's territory. And every time you do, you're rolling the dice. Most of the time, you make it. The panther is asleep. The water is calm. The crossing is routine. But sometimes, the panther wakes. And when it does, you have seconds to react. Seconds to make decisions that will determine whether you live or die. And most of the time, it doesn't matter what you decide, because once the panther has chosen you, you're already gone. The names. There are over 2,000 wrecks on the bottom of Lake Erie. That's over 2,000 ships, over 2,000 crews, thousands and thousands of people who left port and never came home. Each one has a name. The SS Daniel J. Morell, the SS Marquette and Bessemer No. 2, the James B. Colgate, the Merida, the Marshall F. Butters, the D.L. Filer, the William B. Davik, the City of Erie, the Conemaugh, the W.C. Moreland. Each one has a story. A captain who made a decision, a crew that followed orders, a family waiting on the dock for a ship that never arrived. Each one has a moment. The moment the storm hit, the moment the hull cracked, the moment the water poured in, the moment they realized they weren't going to make it. And for every wreck we know about, there are probably more we don't. Ships that sank in the 1700s before records were kept. Ships that were never reported missing because no one knew they were gone. Ships that lie on the bottom of the lake, covered in silt, waiting to be found. The lake holds them all. It keeps them, preserves them. The cold water of Lake Erie doesn't corrode steel the way salt water does. Wrecks can sit on the bottom for 100 years and still look intact. Divers have found ships with dishes still on the tables, with cargo still in the holds, with skeletons still in the bunks. The lake doesn't let go. It keeps what it takes. And every time a ship goes down, the lake adds another name to the list, another story to the collection, another ghost to the graveyard. Because Lake Erie is not just a body of water. It's a repository, a record, a memorial. It's the largest mass grave in North America, and it's still growing. Conclusion. So why is Lake Erie the deadliest of the Great Lakes? Because it's shallow, which makes the waves vertical. Because it's narrow, which makes the storms fast. Because it's warm, which makes the weather unpredictable. Because it freezes, which adds another layer of danger. And because it's busy, which means more ships, more exposure, more chances for disaster. But more than any of that, it's deadly because it doesn't behave the way water is supposed to behave. Waves don't roll, they spike. Storms don't build, they explode. Ships don't just sink, they snap in half or vanish entirely, leaving nothing behind. Lake Erie is a predator. The Iroquois knew it. The sailors know it. And now you know it. The lake lies calm. It purrs in the sun. And then, without warning, it twitches its tail. And if you're on the water when that happens, you're already gone. Over 2,000 ships rest on the bottom of Lake Erie. Over 2,000 crews who thought they knew what they were doing. Over 2,000 moments when steel became kindling and experience became irrelevant. And the lake is still there, still shallow, still spiking, still waiting. Because Lake Erie doesn't need to be the biggest, or the deepest, or the coldest. It just needs to be itself, and that's more than enough. The panther is patient, the panther is sudden, and the panther does not forgive mistakes. Modern engineers call it hydrodynamics. They talk about wave resonance and structural fatigue and rapid weather intensification. The Iroquois called it Arielhonen, the long tail, the spirit of the panther. But they're describing the same thing, a body of water that kills with efficiency, with pattern, with intent, a lake that remembers. And every sailor who crosses Lake Erie knows the truth, even if they won't say it out loud. The panther is always there, always watching, and sometimes it wakes up hungry. When it does, you can't outrun it. You can't fight it. You can only hope you're not the one it chooses, because the lake doesn't give warnings. The lake doesn't negotiate. The lake takes what it wants, and when it's done, it goes back to sleep, flat, calm, glassy, as if nothing ever happened. But beneath the surface, 2,000 ships lie waiting, 2,000 stories, 2,000 crews, 2,000 moments when someone looked at the sky, felt the wind shift, and realized too late that the panther was awake. Lake Erie is the deadliest of the Great Lakes, not because it's the biggest or the deepest or the coldest. It's the deadliest because it's the most efficient killer, and it's been perfecting its method for 10,000 years. The Iroquois tried to warn us. They told us the lake was alive. They told us it had teeth. They told us to be careful. We didn't listen, and the lake has been collecting the evidence ever since.